Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, the only podcast which is devoted to .NET Core, ASP.NET Core, EF Core, Signal R, and not forgetting the .NET Core community itself. I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman Taylor, and this is a special episode of the podcast created specifically to celebrate the show's second birthday. In this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about the show and a little bit about the evolution of .NET. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. Back in early 2018, I was thinking about why there weren't any podcasts on .NET Core. I'd reached out to a few friends to see whether they thought it was a good idea to start one, and they were all supportive of the idea. I'd already seen success with a video gaming podcast that I'd started with my brother called The Waffling Tailors, so I already knew the amount of effort that was required for such a show. Took myself off to my local coffee shop with my laptop in hand, sat with a coffee and started planning out some episodes. I started with the idea of 3 episodes and ended up planning every single monologue. That is, except for this one and a few as of yet unreleased ones. This meant that the first 13 monologues were written and planned out before I'd ever recorded a thing. This is something that I would advise people to do all the time. In fact, it's part of a Getting Started in Podcasting course that I'm putting together with RJJ Software, and it's how we got started with the Tabs and Spaces podcast, which is a podcast that I work on with Zach Brady and James Stoddart. I had long-term goals for the show back then, and those goals were get to 21 episodes and get a large audience. Hopefully you can hear the bunny quotes. My original notes say large equals 100 listeners per month, so I'm consistently blown away when I look at the statistics for the show and see that there is an average of 11,000 listens a month. I remember being completely awed when the show first hit 1,000 all-time downloads, so when I look at the stats today, a few days ahead of recording, and see that the same stats are sitting at 205,000 all-time downloads for the life of the show, I'm kind of lost for words. One of the most interesting statistics for the show, at least for me, is the number of listens for episode 6. But what is mono? Being that mono is both a .NET technology and a word that also means single, I find it really interesting that it's only had 1 listen since its release on October 5th, 2018. However, when you add the numbers from the YouTube channel, each episode is simultaneously released on YouTube and into the RSS feed, it seems that it's more popular in video form. At the time of recording, it has 463 views. Before going on, I want to issue a huge thank you to all the guests, all the people who've given advice, and to you, the listeners. Without all of you, this show would have disappeared after the first 10 or so episodes. It's no joke that the support for this show continues to completely blow me away. So, thank you ever so much. Reflecting on .NET. A few weeks back, I sent out a tweet saying, I'm working on a special episode on the evolution of .NET and .NET Core. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we've come from and where we're heading, and what you'd love to see in .NET. I'll quote you, and you can even be on the episode discussing it. Reach out today. This came a few weeks after me asking a similar thing on LinkedIn. Check the show notes for details on that. I wanted to get the thoughts of the folks in the .NET community on the evolution of .NET and use them as sort of fuel for a discussion on where we think .NET could be headed. Community quotes. First, there's a wonderfully succinct quote from Lee Engelston. Look out for an episode with him on AR and .NET coming soon. And he says, quote, "For me, .NET is a varied toolbox for my imagination and creativity." Close quotes. I completely agree with Lee here. He's managed to hit the nail on the head about .NET's ability to get to the heart of creating a solution to a problem, exploring the technology, or creating something. It's fun to do and you can just get started really quickly. Next up is Dustin Metzger. You may remember him from episode 3. And he says, quote, ".NET Core's biggest improvement for me is decentralization. .NET Framework grew in big steps from 1.0 to 4.5 with very little influence from its users or visibility into its construction. .NET Core not only opens the source but also exposes the teams and the devs involved in each project. You can see the issues filed and the conversations around them. Most packages follow their own cadence instead of one massive release for everyone, and individuals that don't want to see a project die because Microsoft isn't investing in it anymore can take the project over and even be endorsed and supported by the .NET Foundation, close quotes. For me, it's been amazing to watch the folks behind .NET move it over to open source, split it up into components, and allow those components to evolve, or for the community to continue to support and improve those which Microsoft doesn't think they could give justice to. For that reason, I agree with Dustin here. If you're interested in finding out more about the .NET Foundation, I'd recommend listening to episode 19. Friend of the show Peter Shaw had a fair amount to say, so I've split his quote into several points. Firstly, he says, quote, "I feel that with Core, Microsoft have finally gotten .NET right. Personally, I think it should have been cross-platform years ago, instead of depending on the likes of Mono to provide its cross-platform user story," unquote. Supporting the cross-platform story out of the box was always going to be a tough point for Microsoft, but I'm really glad that they have chosen to do it. I remember saying to Dave Rail back in episode 15 that being able to run the same code on my Windows 10 machine, Mac OS machines, and my Linux-based machines was a dream of mine for a long time. Peter goes on to say, quote, ".NET to me is now actually genuinely useful for many of the same reasons I was almost tempted to the dark side of Node.js, being free to build on whatever platform I desire and having a super flexible usage model that allows me to automate it from anything and anywhere," unquote. That is so true, and an important parallel to draw. In fact, .NET Core started its life using libuv, which is the same I/O library that Node used at the start of its development. It was replaced in version 0.90 of Node, by the way. I like to think that Node was seen as a direct competitor to .NET, which was likely why version 1 of .NET used a project.json file similar in format to the package.json found in Node projects. Peter wraps up with this point. Quote, "It's taken .NET a long time to get to this kind of level, but we're now here, and the future is looking very rosy indeed," close quote. And I agree, the future of .NET is looking very exciting indeed. I asked over on the Coding Blocks Slack. If you don't listen to their show, you really should. And Russ Hammett had this to say, quote, "It's so much more user-friendly and accessible to people now. I worked on an original framework project a few months back, and boy did I hate it after being used to what we have now regarding project files, specifically CSproj, and NuGet package management. I didn't think it was as bad at the time, but oh my goodness do I now," close quote. It's true that going back to older framework projects can be difficult. .NET Framework does things differently to how .NET Core, or .NET 5 as it will soon be known, does things. But that's because there have been 20 years of innovation and improvement, and we also don't build software like we used to. .NET Framework was always meant for enterprise-level applications which would never reach outside of the intranet. But now we have infinitely scalable services being served from data centers from all over the world. It's exciting stuff to be sure. Russ also said, quote, "Visual Studio Community is a very nice thing to have for people just getting started tinkering at home and or with open source projects. Open source Microsoft is just more accessible than the pre-Nadella, I think, days," close quote. The free tiers of Microsoft's tooling for .NET development are up there in terms of quality with some of the most expensive tools for languages and frameworks. Although you don't have to use it, Visual Studio really is one of the most feature-rich IDEs out there, and that's to say nothing of the likes of Rider from JetBrains, which is equally feature-rich, if not more. Devin Goebel, also from the Coding Blocks Slack group, added to that with, quote, "Add to that the fact that all of the tooling is decoupled from the IDE and the OS, and you've got something that is as, if not more, approachable as the industry darling that is JavaScript, with a couple of orders of magnitude fewer files as well," end quote. Whereas .NET Framework development was very coupled to Visual Studio, it could be done without involving Visual Studio, but it wasn't easy. .NET Core is IDE agnostic. In fact, one of the topics of conversation in a future episode with Zach Brady, one of the people that I host Tabs and Spaces with, is whether .NET Core code can be written in Vim. You'll have to wait for that episode to find out whether it can be done, unless you want to install Vim now and try and find out. Mickberg, also from the Coding Block Slack group, had this to say, quote, 1. We got web forms to make applications in a rad way. 2. We got link so that we could access data without typos, e.g. no broken column names at runtime. 3. We got MVC to make our web apps leaner and with more precision. 4. We got cross-platform to help us leverage our code and skills to fulfill the promise of the original Microsoft mission statement, great Microsoft software running on computers everywhere, part of the cloud first and mobile first. And 5, we got open source so that .NET could experiment with other technologies that might not be important today, but could be in the future. Linux, Mac, Raspberry Pi, ARM, Docker, and Kubernetes now with .NET, a full stack means a dev or a small team of devs makes yesterday's impossible hard, and the hard easy. End quote. I agree that everything Microsoft and the .NET community have done since the inception of .NET Core has been driving our applications towards smaller, faster applications which can be booted in more constrained environments. Bold T, again, from the Coding Block Slack, had this to say, quote, I'm a big fan of the evolution. I have to maintain framework projects, and it's kinda bloated compared to .NET Core. I also feel like I'm forced to use VS for those without the CLI. Also, all that syntactic sugar they always add is just awesome. End quote. I agree with everything that Balti says here. The CLI is a joy to use, and the fact that Core is split into fragments means that applications that we build with it can be quite small, meaning that we can spin up copies as quickly as we want. Wrapping up. That was my sort of celebration episode for the second birthday of the podcast, and a little reflection and community input on where we've been. I'm really looking forward to the direction that .NET takes in the next year or so. Be sure to check the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that I talked about and a full transcription of this episode. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/subscribe for ways to do that, and to come back next time for more .NET Core goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.